We know, oh, you can hear me good. As we know, expectation management is the essence of all good public relations. So thank you, Maya, for breaching all of the rules on expectation management. It's brilliant to be here. Let me just move the slides forward. So I'm going to start with a question which becomes more ironic as more and more people leave, because it's the end of the day. And that question is, why are we here? And by why are we here, I don't mean existentially, or even why are you still here at the end of 2 days? It's more a question of why, as communicators, do we do what we do? Why, for those who've been around for a while, are we thinking, how am I still standing? For those, and it's great to see so many students involved today, why am I thinking of entering the industry? And I think that the reason why we're here is because what we do as professional communicators is absolutely fundamental to the way in which the world works, or rather the way it kind of doesn't at the moment. Because, you know, this is ultimately what professional communication does. And ultimately what it really does is a word that, strangely, given that it's the theme for the 2 days, has barely come up, which is relationships. I mean, we are public relations. It's about the interaction of mutually beneficial relationships. And there's no area in which it's more important to think about that fundamental delivery of social good than in the area of issues, crisis, risk and resilience, which is the topic of our panel today. So what we're going to do is we're going to do 3 things. We're going to provoke you with some content from the report that Maya mentioned, a summary and analysis of 11 reports spanning 837 pages. I'm actually 24 years old. It just really ages me every year. Then we're going to unpack some of the key findings and recommendations, and then crucially we're going to explore those findings and recommendations through the lens of this remarkable panel, and crucially through your questions. So that's how we're going to spend the remaining 45 minutes. Incredible panel. I'm going to shut up uncharacteristically and let them introduce themselves. Craig.
Okay, Craig Carroll, the Observatory on Corporate Reputation, based out of New York. I also the co-host of a podcast, Communication Breakdown, available on Thursdays with Steve Dowling, the former Chief Comms Officer at Apple and OpenAI.
I'm Ed Whitehead. I am, in reality, a PR person cosplaying as a researcher. I spent 16 years in corporate comms. I joined Ipsos last year. I'm in the corporate reputation team, and I am the editor of the Ipsos Reputation Council report.
Hi, I'm Catherine Metcalf, and I guess my cosplay is as an academic. That's a new role for me. I'm really a 5-time CCO, most recently at CVS Health, but also Deloitte, Aetna, BMS, and other pharmaceutical companies. I've been working a lot with Paige on a really important project that I'll weave into some of my thoughts.
And I now feel obligated to use the word cosplay, but I'm not going to. Just to introduce myself, I'm an independent consultant specializing in what I call human preparedness, organizational resilience, and business performance. 25 years in big agency, visiting fellow at Cardiff, and special advisor to the CIPR's Crisis Communications Network. So, to the report. I'll talk in a second about its genesis, but as context, how and why did I end up doing this report? Well, it's partly because unless I live in a different universe from all of you, the world has got a little bit, I could go very sweary here, but I won't, a little bit messy, shall we say, over at least the last 10 years, probably post-dated to the 2008 crash. We kind of get to the end of each year and we think, oh, thank heavens, at least next year can't be any more weird than this year. And we take the batteries out and we recharge, ready for whatever the year to come has to offer. And by the 5th of January, it's kind of all started all over again. My panel now can't see what the images are, so you're just guessing. It's funny. I love that. Oh, you got it there, Mark.
They're perfect.
Yeah. Yay.
We love them. This January 5th for healthcare. That's JP Morgan.
So, I mean, I don't need to tell you what the architecture of all that is. You probably all know the term VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. You now can't turn around in a room without someone having coined a new 4-letter acronym. We even have a sandwich filling in the form of tuna. Ipsos, a couple of years ago, started talking about navigating a polycrisis amid the New World Disorder. In the UK, Collins Dictionary made permacrisis their word of the year. And it's almost as if Murphy's Law, which is that if anything can go wrong, it probably will, has become hardwired. And I say this not to be negative or depressing, but simply as a description of what I see and feel in the world around me. So 3 years ago, I was pouring my way through 300 pages of all the reports that come out before Davos, and thought, why has nobody summarized these? And a little voice said to me, good idea, why don't you? And I thanked the voice for ruining my life for about 6 weeks and did just that, summarizing 5 reports. People kind of went, that's kind of useful, thank you so much for doing it, can you do it again? So with increasing levels of masochism, I extended from 5 reports to 8 in 2024. This year, I went from 8 to 11, nearly killed me, even with AI, I can let you know. So it's a report called Reputation, Risk and Resilience, Where Are We Now and What Happens Next? If you want to read this year's report, there's a QR code, because that's obligatory. And in it, there is, if you only want to read one page, there's a thing I call the letter to the CEO and chair, which is, if you like, a sort of synthesis of the entire report in one page. I'm going to rapidly run through the key themes, 10 of them, and then the key recommendations, and then I'm going to challenge you with a few of those. So very, very quickly, I'm going to start at number 3. So last year I talked about geopolitics going from global to regional to local. Now it's gone from local to personal, and you don't need me to tell you about the extent of geopolitical flux in the world. Climate emergency, over 10 years, the World Economic Forum tells us, remains the top 5 risks over a 10-year period, and yet, relatively speaking, it's being pushed out by a range of other risks. The economy, still fairly important, but actually falling down the agenda somewhat. What I call one of the sleeping giant risks is a real pandemic in mental health, poor mental health and well-being, on the one hand, and plummeting employee engagement. Someone mentioned Gallup, their global state of the workplace report, for the first time since 2009 fell. Just over 1 in 5 people are now engaged in the workplace. So if you combine that employee disengagement with plummeting mental health, and you have what I've called a sleeping giant risk. Last year I talked about the terrible twins of polarization on the one hand and mis and disinformation on the other. I've extended that this year and called it the terrible triad, because you still have that pairing, but what that is doing, as we all know, is it's feeding and being fed by populism on the one hand and authoritarianism on the other. Cyber security, or rather cyber insecurity, has been at the top of virtually every risk list for a decade. It remains there. What's interesting, though, of course, it's being turbocharged by AI. We see this in the news cycle at the moment. And interestingly, the biggest disruptor to business in the 12 months to last May was financial fraud through cyber hacks. Another societal one, and it was really interesting hearing about rage and fairness being the new currency. There is a real sense of what I termed a lurking spectre of a sense of inequality and injustice around both income and life opportunities. And that's related, finally, to the idea that there are real intergenerational tensions emerging as a result of super-aging populations. I left the first 2 to the end because although those are the individual buckets of risk, what's really interesting is that the risk register overall has become relatively stable, but is intensifying every year. AXA, in its future risks report, says that the stability of the risk list is a call to action in its own right. But then crucially, and this for me is the ultimate sort of meta risk, is the fact that all of these risks are playing off and mutually reinforcing each other. And we've just heard about it with the whole question of things like vaccine hesitancy and climate denialism. So those are the 10 risks. There were also 3 dynamics underlying those. They're what I call steady state risks, the stuff we know about because it's in the news cycle: geopolitics, economics, cybersecurity, climate emergency. Then there are the sleeping giants, and I've touched on them: demographic tensions, mental health and well-being, and employee disengagement. and the growing social tensions that go with these. And then there were three what I call risk accelerators, which were the fact that all of this is becoming very structural and very embedded and very systemic. Secondly, all of the interconnectedness that I mentioned. And thirdly, and we'll come back to this a lot, there's a real focus on resilience being about operations and structures and not about what I think really matters is what I call critical human infrastructure. So, what do you do about it? I'm going to pick 3 or 4 and then double click on a few of the others. Number one, which has become an absolute obsession of mine, is what Professor Deborah Arnott at the MIT calls sense-making and sense-giving, which for me is the hidden superpower. There is no other thing that the comms function does like no other function. So I think sense-making and sense-giving is something we need to think about very consciously because it is the essence of what we do as communicators. I talked a lot in the report about moving from, and we've heard it a couple of times over the 2 days, from having a global strategy to having one that as the world gets more and more fragmented, respects local languages, cultures, we talked about cultural fluency, local norms and mores and behaviors. We talked a lot, and we heard in the crisis session so far, about the fact that comms, crisis and reputational risk are not a job just for the comms function. So cross-functional readiness, crisis as a team sport. And finally, there's a sort of rallying cry at the end of the report, is that because there is huge upside to be had with real crisis preparedness, the comms function needs to be becoming much more internally activist about the upside value. So those are the 10 recommendations. Let's double down on a couple of those, and then we'll go to the panel and to you. So if I say the word crisis, without overthinking it in any way, give me a word or phrase that comes to you when I say the word crisis. Just shout it out. Bad, thank you, you fell into the trap. Carry on. Loss of ROI, wow. Planning, good. Damaging. Unexpected, yep. Opportunity, there we go. There's always a clever one somewhere in the room. So that's the correct answer, by the way. Because the reason I say this is because our common understanding of the word crisis is that it is 2 things. One is it's a disaster or catastrophe, and secondly, that it's kind of an end point. And that's understandable because that's what common language says. But if you look, and by the way, this is going to get all etymological because for a really, really practical reason, which is that the word crisis comes from a Greek word meaning a moment in time which requires a choice, a decision, or a judgment. The Mandarin symbol, you may have seen this before, for crisis consists of the symbols for danger and opportunity. And crucially, the first time it was used in the English language, it meant a point in a disease which determines whether the patient recovers or deteriorates and dies. So because we go into the act of crisis preparedness thinking, forgive my French, it's about stopping bad shit happening or minimizing the damage if it does, we act accordingly. And if you don't believe me, look at some statistics. So there was a research study done about 10 years ago, which looked at the share price impact of 200 mass fatality events and found that, unsurprisingly, companies that did badly lost 15% of their stock value over the next 6 months. But companies seem to have done well, saw a 5% uptick in their share price over the same period. So there is, as I say in the report, opportunity in every risk and risk in every opportunity. We need to move the definition of crisis on from, the focus on impacting reputation and relationships and business as usual, to what I obsess about, which is that crises, from my lived experience of working on the crisis front line, is ultimately a human experience with very real human consequences that needs a human response based on human empathy. We need to start distinguishing more effectively between issues and crises. We all have, professionally and personally, issues circulating around. The extent to which they rear up and become crises, unexpected, very often it's not. So the issues-crisis continuum is a continuum, it's not an either-or. If I became Prime Minister, luckily for everyone I won't, I would ban the term PR crisis, because in my experience, it doesn't exist, or it very rarely exists. PR crises are the result either of structures and governance and leadership and decision-making, or the result of culture, values, and behaviours. Just to dwell on that, there's a brilliant book by Rupert Younger and David Waller in which they distinguish between capability crises, which are about what you do, product, services, operations, and character scandals, which are about your values, your culture, behavior, your transparency. And there's a really interesting piece of work from a company called Senate SHJ, which mapped 300 crises across 44 years and found that the type of crisis that damaged share price the most was what they called white-collar behavior or white-collar crime. And the crises that did the least damage to share price in the long term was cybersecurity. So it's some nice data on why operational crises, I think, are somewhat priced in reputationally. One of my other challenges is that we obsess with reputation, and I know that seems a weird thing for a comms person to do, and so we should. But reputation is ultimately only what people understand, think, and feel about you. What really matters is how they behave and act as a result. So when I'm doing work with clients, I say, yeah, let's look at reputation, but we need to think about the practical relationship risk. How is this crisis showing up in stakeholders' actual behavior rather than just the reputational piece? As we aspire to have that seat at the top table that we bang on about, I will leave this profession with people going, we need a seat at the top table. Part of the reason we don't is because we use language, frankly, inaccurate and lazy ways. So we use terms like threat, risk, vulnerability interchangeably. They are very specific. A risk is a threat multiplied by a vulnerability. We also need to challenge businesses who, of course, are rightly interested in business continuity and a return to business as usual. But in the report, I've started talking about not only business as usual, but reputation as usual, which has a much longer tail. You can recover operationally and yet see a much longer impact on reputation, and therefore also thinking about relationship continuity, not just business continuity. We need to be much clearer in 6 months' time. What do we want people to think about the way in which we behaved and communicated? There's a term, strategic intent, and we need to know how we're going to go about that. In other words, as we make decisions, how do we use our values to get to that point? A point which, if I said to you, by the way, what is the single most important attribute of a leader in a crisis, what would you say? Integrity, good. Hit me with a few more.
Calmness.
Say again? Calmness, good. You're meant to say empathy. I'll pretend you said empathy. I mean, you saw the nudge. So when I was at Ketchum, we did a global study every year looking at public perceptions of leadership, communication, and how they related. And one question was exactly what I just asked you. The data came back. The least important behavior out of a list of 17 was showing empathy. The second least was communicating openly and transparently. We went back to Ipsos and said, there's a problem with the data. They went, there really isn't. Have a look at the top two. And the top two were having a clear plan of action, and number two was identifying the nature of the challenge. And then it all made sense, because in a crisis, we ask two questions at a human level. Do they care? Tick. Great. What are they going to do about it? So we came up with this phrase, operationalizing empathy, which is turning empathy into concrete action. One of the other challenges in the report is that when we are challenged as human beings, if we're threatened physically, say, we go into fight, flight, or freeze. I think organisations do the same, and their reaction is to go, oh, defend and protect, we've got to defend ourselves. And in the process, they end up doing the exact opposite. So one of my final requests and challenges is that we need to move in crisis situations away from a focus on the self of the organisation to the other, because if you do that, you end up protecting yourself. And then the final one, which, on my professional gravestone will be inscribed the phrase human preparedness. We need to get away from this idea that having systems and processes and manuals and playbooks is enough. It is a vital starting point, but it's necessary and not sufficient, because without culturally embedding all of that, without training and without stress testing through simulations, and I've seen this again and again, a process and a system is just a process and a system. It's meaningless unless it's embedded at a human level. So 3 final challenges, which I will put to the panel. The first from the report basically says that issues and crises are basically just vulnerabilities that have manifested themselves, risks that have realised, and threats that have materialised. We cannot control, if you like, the stimulus of what's going on in the world. We can control the way in which we respond. The second is that there is huge opportunity, which is my sort of main rallying cry, is that we've got to stop thinking about crisis preparedness like an insurance policy, and none of us like buying insurance. Whereas if I sold you an insurance policy that said, not only will this pay out if a storm hits your house, but it'll identify and repair cracks in the walls and the ceilings to make the building stronger when the storm hits, you'd probably bite my arm off. That is literally what proper crisis preparedness does. And to unlock that, we've got to think of ourselves as sense makers in chief, look as much at relationships as reputation, move from the self to the other, focus as much on character-centred scandals as capability-led crises, and above all else, put critical human infrastructure at the heart of the way in which we prepare should the crisis hit. So, I will now shut up and I will wander over, and as I do so, I will ask my panel an initial question, which is, of all of that, what, in terms of the 10 key themes, resonated most for each of you? And why? Catherine, I'll start with you, if that's okay.
Sure. So, I think for me, the consistency of permacrisis, and that being a theme for everyone. In fact, I don't even think of it as permacrisis anymore. It's just doing business. So if I look back at my last corporate role at CVS Health, we had 300,000 employees, and 85% of Americans lived within 5 miles of our store. There was an issue, a problem, or a crisis every single day. And one of the things that I really worry about when I reviewed the report is we are all running so fast and so furious, and we are working so hard just to keep up. And the good news, and I'll refer to some page study details, we did a benchmarking report, and one of the really solid findings is that 75% of our members' budgets either grew or were stable. So it seems to indicate that in a moment of crisis and turbulence, our value is being appreciated. Mm-hmm. Now, you can ask how long that's going to last. I don't know. But what I would say is it's very clear that the reward for doing good work is getting more and more and more good work. Mm-hmm. But as a function, we're not as good at taking away things, not doing things, and deprioritizing things. So everyone I know is running so fast that the group you're ignoring, to your own peril, I would argue, is your own team. So are we building the right skills for the future? Are we organizing our teams in the right way? Are we training and doing things earlier? I'm not sure we should have crisis teams anymore. Let me be provocative. Now, it used to be that was quite popular. Crisis is just part of doing business. Are we better off training all of our teams to spot, identify, and work things in advance? So I totally agree with Todd. We realized we're not able to put out a playbook that has all of the things that you're going to be addressing. Rod's outlined way too much. You'd overwhelm the team. So we did do a process move, and we said, here are the things that we would respond to in these circumstances. Here are the things that we would never respond to, and here are the things that are very nuanced. We'd have to have thought around. So I think we need to put the oxygen mask on first and really think about our own organizations and get off the hamster wheel.
Yeah, I love that. That came up earlier on, the idea, people have risk appetite statements. I love the idea of having a comment appetite statement. In other words, what are the things on which we're willing to comment? Just quickly, I noticed in the benchmarking study as well, that although budgets are, are holding up well, I think 60% of CCOs said they felt they were under-resourced. Is crisis included in that sense of under-resourcing, did you get a feel?
It is definitely included in that.
Yep.
And I think, again, I go back to the reward for doing more good work is getting more work. The better you are at connecting the dots, the better you are at playing outside of your own organization, leadership in absence of direct authority, then the more and more valuable you become and the more you take on. And then it becomes impossible for your team to really be effective with normal systems and processes, which is why the page work that we're doing, it's called the Navigator, and it'll be launched very soon, helps you really look at what is the North Star for excellence in your organization. How do you make deliberate choices on what you're going to be excellent at, what you're prioritizing, what you're not prioritizing, and what's the path to get there. So I'm excited about the work, more to come.
I'm not surprised, I'm not in commission, but everything the page does is always of the highest quality, so I look forward to that. Ed, 10 themes, what one resonated above all others?
Yeah, I think with my Reputation Council hat on, and for those of you who don't know, Ipsos has been running the Reputation Council since 2009. It's in its 18th sitting. It is a gathering of communications leaders at some of the world's biggest organizations. This year is our largest cohort yet, 161 CCOs and corporate affairs directors, VPs, across 19 markets. And the overarching sort of biggest challenge, we opened every single interview with just a nice icebreaker. What's the biggest challenge or the three biggest challenges facing you and your organization at the moment? And the overwhelming top response was geopolitics. And in fact, one Reputation Council member told me, if it's my top three, it's geopolitics, geopolitics, geopolitics. And it is the promotion that you never asked for. You're now not only responsible for internal comms, media relations, stakeholder engagement, sometimes investor relations, sometimes ESG statements, sometimes annual reporting. You're now also having to analyze and make sense of all of the complex geopolitical situation that's going on, which sort of links to that sense maker, sense giver piece, which we'll get onto in more detail. But yeah, for me, it's geopolitics, certainly.
Craig, 14 years of the centre. What resonated for you from all that background?
Wow. Okay. Well, at the heart of the report, you talk about the say-do gap. I'm going to use the triangle of claims, perceptions, and reality. So the claim that I saw in the report was that companies were over-claiming their preparedness. And I found that to be interesting, that they were talking more about it, but the perception was, and I think Paul actually had a couple of quotes in the report about the degree of populism and the degree of polarization that puts that in immediate conflict. And then the reality, which was that they're focused more on compliance than capabilities, and that the reality is that companies simply weren't prepared.
Brilliant. So, because there's a quote from the National Preparedness Commission in the UK, which is, we can't just admire the problem, so we need to do something about it. So the reason I added those 10 recommendations, which are purely a personal take based on the analysis. So in reverse order, starting again with Craig, of the recommendations, which ones, there was the diagnosis and the prescription. Which of those prescriptions did you think that's interesting?
Of the prescriptions,
yes.
Oh my gosh. Boy, how are we going to do this in,
Shall I put them back up?
20 minutes, right? Good grief. I'm going to come back to this idea of, well, I guess we'll talk about narrative contradiction a little bit later here, but the big issue here is how do we reconcile the claims and the strategy of the company with the audiences that we're dealing with the operational realities. Okay, that's the big thing here. But I'm so glad you put the list back up here. Okay, so there's a few things that I see that are going on that's a little bit different now than, you asked about the 14 years. First, I don't think it's enough to look at it purely from a communications lens. There's right now a change that's going. I'm going to describe this in terms of 4 pluses or 4 additions. One, it's understanding that the communicator's role is expanding. So many more are adopting social impact or HR or marketing, but we have to be able to expand the lenses through which we view what's going on. So understanding the business impact and the business outcomes, we can also add social outcomes. So the first plus is understanding the CCO plus as an expansion of responsibilities. The second, I think, is going to be a greater awareness and greater clarity about our operating environment. There's so much that was going on in the report about the complexity, the polarization, and I'm going to call that the media environment plus. So many CCOs come out of a media environment, but it's understanding, as we've been talking about for the past couple of days, that we need to understand the cultural environment and cultural resonance. That's certainly a theme that has come up. So second is expanding to understand it's not just the media environment, it's the informational environment. It's understanding the larger geopolitical issues and understanding the world that affects our assets, resources, capabilities. So the second, the media environment plus. The third, I'm going to say, is just understanding it's more than just stakeholders, so the stakeholder plus. It's understanding that, for the people that we are serving, that not everybody's a stakeholder. And we have what I'm going to call stakeholder creep, right? And if everybody's a stakeholder, nobody's a stakeholder. And understanding that we have constituents, understanding that stakeholders are also audiences, understanding that there are markets, and understanding that there are victims, and understanding the authorities are not stakeholders. So I think expanding our understanding of that there's other roles and other groups of people beyond stakeholders. And I think the last is, and I think you hit on it a lot in the report, is that you talked a little bit about the bipolar nature, or actually I think you used the triad. But I'm going to say we have historically thought about it from a bipolar side of crisis on one side and CSR on the other. But the new world that we're operating in is it's really a triangle where we're in the middle. It's CSR, the values, the purpose that we're trying to serve in society, understanding the risks with crises. And then the third is just understanding this is a world of chaos right now. And chaos is not crisis. And understanding that we're being pulled in those 3 directions, and the outcomes here mean that we're in the center being pulled in so many different directions. So I'm going to hit on this idea of sense making and sense giving, that we're right here in the middle, but we have to maintain our composure, we have to maintain our grounding, we have to be able to assert our cross-functional readiness. I'll pause there.
Yeah, well, I think that cross-functional readiness is a really interesting point, because comms has always reached into all sorts of different functions. And when we asked Reputation Council members which of these departments or functions do you work with, and we listed 10, it was basically all plus more. So comms has always had that reach. And with the, as you said, all those pluses that are being added on to the requirements of the comms role, 67% of Reputation Council members say that their jobs have become, or their responsibilities have become more difficult to manage over time. And with that, CCOs are having to become, they can't handle everything. They can't have oversight of absolutely everything. So they're having to become more nimble, having to become smarter, having to become better at collaboration, and also sort of have a bit more trust and let some things go. And that comes to that cross-functional readiness and embedding the right level of reputational smarts and risk awareness across the organisation, so that not every potential risk has to come across the desk of a busy CCO, but there's enough sense, common sense to know what does need flagging and what does need to be brought to attention. I think the challenge is, how do you make sure that your colleagues' confidence doesn't outstrip their competence? So, I sort of think about it as you want a network of smoke detectors, not a posse of amateur firefighters. You don't want these people trying to handle these massive risks on their own, but you want them to be able to flag potentially big challenges before it becomes an issue.
And I love the phrase in the report, polycrisis calls for polymaths. I thought that was a nice summary. Catherine?
I'll pick up one that's referenced, but I think often underplayed in an organization, and that is your internal employees. I think there have been a few of the panels that talked about the importance of that. But what I would say is that, in the past, your employees lined up behind you, and it was, us versus this, crazy lawsuit that we were hit with, or, us versus a regulator, or, some government, issue. And what's happening now is that it's employee against employee, and they're both right. They're both believing, as some of our panelists had said, something really critical. So at CVS Health, we saw this come up with women's reproductive rights when Dobbs broke, right? Mm-hmm. Half your employees were, pro-choice, the other half were pro-life, and they were having it out in the hallways. So I think part of the new game is being able to help employees have conversations, agree to disagree, but also not have employees look to the company as we're responsible for solving these issues. We're not. One of the things that we really leaned into is CVS has one voice. Our employees have 300,000 voices. Go out and use your voice. And not just, hey, everybody donate to the PAC. It's, here's what you need to know in your market. Here are the important legislative things, and you need to have a vote. Regardless of what your position is, take it, be vocal, and push that energy outside. But internal comms, I think, has an entirely different flavor with these issues where you're battling internally, employee against employee.
Yeah, I'm constantly amazed but unamazed at how much media coverage and therefore media relations becomes the default setting in crisis comms, when in reality, we always say the media are a channel, not an audience, and there are so many audiences to which media become a channel, starting internal. Yeah. It's
true. Well, all those leaks that we have, where are they coming from?
Yeah.
Come on, and employees are getting news from LinkedIn and from their monitoring services before they hear an official company position. Mm-hmm. So this is an important topic, I think.
Absolutely. Again, I'm just going to stay with you because you've been a CCO no fewer than 5 times. I'm not asking, obviously, for names, details, or pack drill, but I'm quite interested. How did attitudes towards the whole area of issues, crisis, risk differ across those 5 organizations, or was it relatively similar in each case?
I would say there were clear differences. Mm-hmm. In healthcare, in pharmaceuticals in particular, you have a learned intermediary, right? Your doctor writing the prescription. You have a whole healthcare system that is around you. And while most people could understand the name of the drug that they took or the medicine that they were using every day, not everyone knew the company that made it, right? So there was a little bit of an opportunity to use advocacy, to build coalitions and to address issues in a longer term view. You knew what was coming up, adverse events, off-label use, things like that. When you step into a realm like a CVS Health, where your issues are, guns in the store, it's an entirely different game. And when you have these things that you've outlined as, culture and character flaws, companies that are so large, you can be doing 99% of everything right, 99.5%, and you're still going to have issues that crop up. That's what the challenge is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I always joke in training when people say, clients phone up and go, what should we do in a crisis? And the answer, there are 2 words that are the heart of crisis comms, which is it depends. It depends on the crisis, the organization, the context, the culture. The list is endless. Craig, if I may, again, from having run the Centre for many years and the podcast, how have you seen this whole area evolve over the years, be it positively or less so?
Right. I think, first of all, it's so hard to think about the past 14 years. When you look at the 14 months, right? We've had as much change in the past 14 months as the 14 years. But I'd say those 4 pluses, right? Understanding that we have an expansion of responsibilities. I think it's an expansion of our operating environments that we're responsible for and developing awareness of. I think it's beyond the thinking beyond the stakeholder to the stakeholder plus, understanding that we have other groups of people that we have relationships with beyond stakeholders. And I think a key one, for example, that companies have been missing is this idea of constituents. When I think of constituents, I always think of the word like of voting, right? At some point, some decision is going to be made, and understanding that once that decision is made, you got to live with the consequences, right? So there's the preparation, and then there's like the how you play after the vote is made. So I think that understanding that we have an expansion of groups there. I think another key difference is now that we're talking about chaos, and that we are understanding that chaos is not crisis. They are 2 completely different things. Yeah. And I love going back to your report, this focus on linguistic precision, because for me, using that triangle of claims, perception, and reality, I think we need to be very clear that a lot of times we're talking about trust when we're really talking about faith, and that's like a strange thing to say, but I think of trust as having evidence and faith being in the absence of evidence. And if we're going to be clear in our terms, right, I think really we're being very disingenuous when we're talking about trust, right? We're asking people to believe in us, but we're not giving them the evidence.
Yeah. And there's the internal trust. I mean, when you're working with the risk or strategy function or the operations function, and you say something and they go, so sorry, do you mean a risk, do you mean a threat, or do you mean a vulnerability? Because they are completely different and they relate in a very specific way. I'm conscious of time and the fact that it's the end of the day. Questions from the floor. We've covered a lot of ground. We have one over on our left, gentleman with his hand raised. Mr. Bully Pulpit from memory, is that right? No.
Testing, great. Thank you all so much. I think it's been a very insightful panel, and I really appreciate how you have unpacked the content of the conversation and dissected it from each of your vantage points. My question more so stems from the conversation where we were parking around the employee sentiment and how to respond to how we engage employees, in the perspective of, you have colleagues in the same organization that has very polarizing different sets of viewpoints. And I would say what's interesting to me is, when I think about the past and I think about now, the biggest difference I see is trust in, I would call like the 4-legged institution. So one of them being the private sector corporations, which we represent. Another one being the academy, so education, higher education institutions. Another one being the public sector or government, all 3 branches or whatever branches of government you say. And that 4th leg of the stool will be nonprofits. In the past, there was some level of trust in either 3 or all of those legs of that stool. But today, we're seeing, and we've seen it from the Edelman Trust Barometer, we've seen it in some of the studies that you said, that a few of those legs have little to no trust or engagement, which puts the interesting piece on the communicator on the private sector to be able to articulate values, purpose, bring faith, and allow people to have faith and erosion. And so I'm just curious in your thoughts in present day when we're seeing that so much pressure has been put on the private sector to account for the lack of other institutions, how as communicators do we continue to authentically navigate forward, advise our clients and advise our key stakeholders internally to really make up that difference, and if that's even possible.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, I want to think about this idea. I want to come back to this idea of the faith. What I really mean is confidence in institutions, our belief in those institutions. So I think part of it is we got to be clear in our terms and be honest with ourselves that we're using trust because it sounds more noble, right? But really, we're not giving the evidence. We're saying, we're making a claim, and we're saying, trust us, believe in us, even though we're not giving any kind of evidence. The other, coming back to, again, the linguistic precision here, I think we got to be honest and call misinformation and disinformation what it is. It's lies and bullshit. But because we're using another language here, we're creating this degree of inauthenticity, right? That for the very people that we're serving here, we're using another language. So we're adding another layer here, which divorces us from the truth. And so I think just being honest and calling it, just using the terms lies and bullshit, we're going to be able to better engage.
I love this panel. We live in a post-crisis world full of lies and bullshit. What a wonderful way to end the conference. One more question, Paul, are we allowed?
Can I add just
Paul,
something
don't
on
quote
this
me on
though?
that.
Sorry, go,
Let me
please.
just say something though, and I want to come back to this saying that's very common, right? A boat doesn't sink because of the water outside of it. It sinks with the water inside. So I think the best thing that we can all do in our organizations is make sure that we are clear in helping the business advance and chart and move forward. You know, it's annual planning time, and I don't think there is such a thing anymore as just an annual plan and you tick the box and move on. Every organization needs to, at least on a quarterly basis, reassess what are the biggest threats to their reputation, what are the biggest opportunities to the reputation, and how do you help navigate on a daily basis and help the business win. I think that's your biggest recipe for success.
And if I could just add, you talked about, how do you help clients, organizations move forward with authenticity and sort of fill the gap that's been left by other institutions. I think it comes back, that's the key phrase, authenticity. It's about, previous panels have discussed this with the importance of a North Star, the importance of values, and actually what's really fallen away is the performative purpose just for PR's sake, whereas the organizations that do have the values and the North Star are the ones that can still use their purpose, and we heard it with some of the brilliant presentations from the award winners first thing this morning. Those organizations that do have that purpose at the heart of them are the ones that can have the permission to continue to drive the agenda, and that's what a lot of our clients come to us for, is research to understand what they believe is their North Star, what they believe are their values, are they actually credible? Do they have authenticity to speak in this sphere? So we do lots of research that helps them understand, yes, you are perceived as being credible in this, so that identifies the areas. So if you can, use research, use Ipsos, we're great, but if not, your clients, or you understand what your clients' real values are and North Star is, so that's the opportunity, I think.
Brilliant. One more question, and this young lady, by the way, has asked all the best questions the last 2 days. Brace yourselves, panel, this is going to be good.
Very quick question.
Very quick answer. Yep.
Okay, this question might also be too niche to answer, so that might help with time. But building off of the cross-functional readiness and practical questions you guys have up there, what are your thoughts on cyber insecurity in relation to the U.S.'s weak energy grid? As AI consumes so much energy, aren't we just priming ourselves to be ready for attack at any moment? And then, if yes, what is your guys' perspective in responding to that? Because I know you mentioned that that's the easiest thing to bounce back from, but if it's on a national scale, I don't know how easy that would be.
I did tell you, I love being facilitator because I can now go, panel, what do you reckon?
I was going to say, isn't that the easy question, right? This is quick. No, I think it is a very valid point, and I would just look at, for example, some of the work we saw in the awards last night, the idea of taking the freezing temperature down and doing things that are healthy. I think technology, while it creates problems, can also help us solve problems. So I'll be watching this one. Good to highlight it.
It's a classic example of intersectional risk where all of the individual risks mutually reinforce and play off each other. I know Paul wants to get on. Oh, Craig, can Craig answer very quickly, Paul?
Yeah, sure. Tune into Communication Breakdown. It drops Thursday morning on Spotify. All the major platforms will take on your question there.
Good. Panel, thank you very much. Really fascinating discussion. Thank you.